I'd like to welcome everyone very warmly to the 2004-2005 William James Lecture. I'd like to say a word before we move to the introduction of our distinguished speaker today, a bit about the William James Lecture. In 1968, the John Lindsley Fund gave the sum of $50,000 to establish here at Harvard Divinity School a fund to endow the William James Lectures on Religious Experience for the purpose of having an outstanding scholar or scholars lecture annually on some aspect of this subject. The fund was established by Thayer Lindsley, son of John Lindsley, who had a long-standing interest in William James as a teacher and in his religious ideas. It seemed appropriate to the trustees of the fund to establish these lectures in honor of William James at HDS. James had earned a medical degree, as you probably know, from Harvard and taught at the medical school. He subsequently was given an honorary doctorate from Harvard as well. But James's varieties of religious experience was based in part on a questionnaire about religious practices that was circulated throughout the Harvard community by one of his students. James's aim, however, was not to defend religion by scientific proof, but rather to stake out his own position as a, quote, piecemeal supernaturalist, one who admits miracles and providential leadings and finds no intellectual difficulty in mixing the ideal and real worlds together, end quote. To locate where the ideal region interacted with the real world's details to cause experiences, things like prayer, epiphany, or visions that generate faith. And those are all the quotations there from James's Genuine Reality. The Divinity School inaugurated the new lecture series of the William James Lectures 2 years after the gift was made in 1970-71, with a series of 4 lectures and panels in that year. Speakers in the years since have included a number of notables that are almost as eminent as this year's speaker: R.D. Lang, James Hillman, Charles H. Long, Robert Coles, Carol Gilligan, Clifford Geertz, and most recently Gayanath Obiasekere. This year's lecturer, Bernard McGinn, will be introduced tonight by our colleague Kevin Madigan. Kevin, I'm going to turn it over to you, but Bernie, it's a great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Bill, and good afternoon, all. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, who is an honored teacher and friend. Since Professor McGinn has many friends, colleagues, readers, and fans in the audience, and is thus well known to many or to most of you, I want to keep my introductory remarks very brief. Now Naomi Shenstone Donnelley Professor Emeritus, Professor McGinn taught at the University of Chicago Divinity School from 1969 to 2003. Trained in theology and in medieval history, he was a member of both the theology and the history of Christianity areas in the Divinity School and served as adjunct professor in the Department of History. A fellow of the Medieval Academy, as well as of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, he has served as president of the American Society of Church History and of the American Catholic Historical Association. Among his many books are works related to the history of Western apocalyptic thought, such as Antichrist, 2,000 Years of the Human Fascination with Evil, as well as numerous works on Christian spirituality and mysticism. His major project, which I know is widely read in these halls, is an ongoing history of Western Christian mysticism. 3 volumes of this have already been published to great acclaim. The 4th volume, entitled The Harvest of Mysticism in Late Medieval Germany 1300 to 1500, has, I understand, just been sent to press and is scheduled to appear in 2005. At Chicago, Professor McGinn was a particularly popular and effective teacher and conscientious advisor of dissertations, of which he oversaw some 66 in his decades at Chicago, for which he deserves perhaps a plenary indulgence. Actually, one of these on Peter O'Leary and the medieval interpretation of Matthew is rumored, at least, to have given Professor McGinn access to the kind of visionary, extraordinary knowledge about which he will be speaking today. But be that as it may, the title of today's lecture is Visions and Visualizations in the Here and Hereafter, the Medieval Visionary Tradition and the Question of Mystical Experience. It's been a great privilege indeed for me to help receive Professor McGinn here, and I hope you'll join me now in welcoming him to the Divinity School. Bernie?
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you very much, Dean Graham, and thanks again, Kevin, for your kind words. A word of apology for delivering this lecture seated. I had a little bout of the flu this weekend, and I thought if I stood and began to get a little spacey or worse, you'd think that I was having a vision instead of merely talking about vision. So I figured it was a little safer for me to sit for this. I want to start by taking you back to an almost forgotten incident that will help to introduce my theme. In the summer of 1202, Pope Innocent III and his court abandoned the mosquito-laden city of Rome for the salubrious retreat of the monastery of Subiaco. An anonymous curial official who did not much like summer camping out wrote a letter to a friend telling him about the activities of the papal officials, including how they sported like fish in the adjacent lake. The Pope himself, according to this letter, enjoyed gargling with the cold water. I quote, "The third Solomon, Innocent III, the third Solomon loved to put his holy hands into it freely and to take a frigid gargle, gargarismus frigidus, to provide medical aid for the twofold need of human life with its double power." During this retreat, strengthened by his gargling, Innocent preached a sermon to the Subiaco community, taking as his text the beatitude, "Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God." This text is one of the scriptural foundations for Christian belief that the visio Dei is the ultimate human felicity. But what that vision would consist in and to what extent it might be shared in this life had long been subject to discussion. Although Innocent was not an original theologian, he had received a good education in Paris. His sermon begins with the classic distinction between two kinds of blessedness, that possible in this life, in via, and the perfect happiness in patria, in heaven. He also treats the seeming contradiction between the promise that the pure of heart will see God and the many biblical texts that deny that God can ever be seen. In good scholastic fashion, the Pope solves the contradiction by distinguishing three kinds of vision. I quote again, "Thus it is necessary to distinguish that one kind of vision is corporeal, another veiled, another comprehensive. The corporeal vision belongs to the senses, the veiled, that is enigmatica, to images, the comprehending to the understanding. The invisible God can never be seen by corporeal vision, though of course the second person of the Trinity who took on flesh in Jesus Christ was seen and will be seen corporeally after the resurrection of the body. In the present life, continues the Pope, the invisible God can be seen by the effect of inspiration, contemplation, prayer, meditation, reading, and preaching, all of which lift the soul up to gazing on God, at least the souls that have been purified. These veiled forms of vision, all dependent on faith, are far inferior to the comprehensive vision of God to come in heaven, on which Innocent waxes eloquent for most of the sermon. Innocent's threefold distinction of ways of seeing God is straightforward and traditional. And one might have thought that the powerful Pope had settled the vision thing, if not once and for all, at least for centuries to come. The story, however, of which I'll give you some elements this afternoon, is quite different. Innocent's generic Augustinian view of visio Dei was about to receive two massive challenges that were to lead to much discussion, contention, and even to condemnations. The debates about seeing God in the here and hereafter were never more varied and fervent than in the last centuries of the Middle Ages. The first challenge to Innocent's view came from what I've called in the past the visionary explosion in Western mysticism. That is, the great increase in accounts of visions of God and other celestial beings that began in the late 12th century and grew apace in the 13th and 14th centuries. These visions were different from the standard showings of the early Middle Ages, either the journeys to heaven and hell or the manifestations of angels and saints for purposes of admonition and of consolation. Many of these new showings involved mystical illumination and transformation. Others were messages about the reform of the church. Some, especially those given to women, describe encounters with Jesus that were more direct, more somatic, even sexual in nature than was customary in previous mysticism. Such visions were often the basis for claims to special authority on the parts of the seers that raised questions among both clerical officials and the mystics themselves. The second challenge to Innocent's broadly Augustinian view was from the Dionysian revival of the 13th century and the subsequent struggles between different ways of understanding Dionysian mystical theology. This theological movement had implications not only for evaluating claims for seeing God and attaining union with God in the depths of the soul, but also for how we understand the beatific vision. In a paper given last summer, I concentrated on how these challenges played out in the debates over the beatific vision. Here, I want to change focus a bit, giving more attention to the visionary explosion and the discussions it prompted, without totally forgetting the issue of the beatific vision, since I contend that the many lines of late medieval thought about seeing God, reflected both in text and in image, need to be seen as part of a larger, if complex, and often amorphous whole. As in so much about the medieval West, we can begin with Augustine, because the Bishop of Hippo set forth a theory of visio Dei, both here and hereafter, that shaped the medieval discussion. With regard to the beatific vision, Augustine insisted that the final satisfaction for all human longing is found in heaven in the contemplation of the good that is unchanging, eternal, and always the same. At the end of the City of God, he summarizes this reward in the following words: "There we shall rest and see and love, love and praise. This is what shall be in the end without end." Later Theology correctly read such statements as indicating a direct mental beholding of the divine nature or essence. With regard to what kind of seeing of God is possible in this life, Augustine, like other fathers, wrestled with the contrasting biblical texts about whether or not God could really be seen here below. His letter treatise, De Videndo Deo of 413, argued against any corporeal vision of God himself, but allowed that some kind of interior vision of God could be given as he willed himself to be seen. As Augustine put it in a sermon on Psalm 41, with the fine point of the mind, the apex mentis, with the fine point of the mind, we are able to gaze upon something unchangeable, although hastily and in part. The impossibility of seeing God's fullness in this life supports the scriptural text claiming that God cannot be seen, while still allowing for inferior forms of vision. Like other patristic and later theologians, Augustine allowed for a few miraculous exceptions, especially in the cases of Moses and Paul, who enjoyed something close to a vision of God's very nature while still alive. But for the vast majority of those who still are caught in the toils of fallen flesh, any interior vision of God and any other experience of God in the spiritual senses is always partial and fleeting. Augustine summarized his view on the kinds of visio Dei found in this life, as is well known in Book 12 of his De Genesi ad Litteram, written about 415. Here the bishop distinguishes three kinds of seeing that can be realized either on a natural or a supernatural register. Seeing is corporalis, spiritualis, or interior by images, and intellectualis, the mind's grasp of truth. These can happen naturally, but they can also happen supernaturally in the sense that God can miraculously create new external objects to be seen in a corporeal way. But more usually, God can also grant visions that are spiritualis or intellectualis. In the midst of a discussion of raptures in which the soul's attention is completely turned away or snatched away from the body's senses, Augustine allows for both imaginative visions sent by God, such as the images given to John in the Apocalypse, as well as higher intellectual visions in which God grants an immediate perception of divine truth. He says, "There the brightness of the Lord is seen, not through a symbolic or corporeal vision or through a spiritual vision, but through a direct vision and not through a dark image, as far as the human mind, elevated by God's grace, can receive it." That's the qualification. In other words, they're always partial. The mind here below can only be partly elevated. Augustine's teaching about the beatific vision and the vision of God possible in via, in this life, were challenged by an alternate view that took the biblical prohibitions against seeing God more literally and denied that God's essence could ever be seen, either in this life or in the world to come. This tradition, which developed in Eastern Christianity, distinguished between the divine essence that is always invisible and the divine energies, manifestations, or theophanies that can be seen in some sense in this life and that will be directly beheld in heaven. Gregory of Nyssa's commentary on the Beatitude about seeing God, that I quoted before, blessed are the pure in heart, they shall see God. This is a good statement of this position, but it was primarily through the Dionysian corpus and its interpreters that this option, if you will, the Eastern option, became present in the West. For Dionysius, theoria, or contemplation of the manifestations of God in the hierarchies of created being, is a vital part of the ascent to God. But his mystical theology insists on the absolute invisibility of God, claiming that Moses, the exemplary mystic, did not contemplate the God who cannot be seen, but only attained a vision of the place where God dwells. According to Dionysius, Moses broke free of everything perceptible to corporeal or mental vision, away from what sees and is seen, and plunged into the mysterious darkness of unknowing, in order to be supremely united to the totally unknown by an inactivity of all knowing. This is the first chapter of the mystical theology. Dionysius then effected a radical separation between all knowing and seeing and union with the unknown God. In chapter 2 of the same work, the mystical theology, however, he describes a paradoxical unknowing which itself is hidden from all those possessed of knowing, by which we may see above being that darkness that is concealed from all the light of beings. So this is a kind of non-seeing seeing, discussed in relationship to what can happen in this life. We have to turn to the first chapter of his other treatise on the divine names to deal with its realization in heaven. In the first chapter of this work, Dionysius says that when we have attained full likeness with Christ in the beatitude of heaven, we shall, and I quote him, enjoy his visible theophany in purest contemplation, illuminated by his radiant beams, just as the apostles were illuminated at the time of his divine transfiguration. In other words, heaven features a vision of the incarnate Son, the fullest manifestation or theophany of God, but the superessential divine nature still remains hidden. The 9th century Irish scholar John Scotus Eriugena not only translated the Dionysian writings into Latin, but in his great work, the Perifusion, developed the Eastern option further, especially with regard to the beatific vision. In reality, if not in the same language, Eriugena accepted the distinction between God's hidden essence and his manifested energies or theophanies. He also used the transfiguration account of Matthew 17 as a paradigm for understanding the forms of contemplation both in this life and the next. The three figures of the transfiguration represent three kinds of contemplation. Elijah is the type of those who contemplate God while still in the body. Moses figures those few saints who see God's higher manifestations when released from the body in rapture and ecstasy. And Christ himself represents those who will enjoy perfect vision after the resurrection of the body. What can never be seen, either in this life or in the next, is God's essence. God is never visible in God's self, but only in his theophanies, the illuminations that objectively are God insofar as he shows himself, and that subjectively are the deifying graces that transform humans. At the end of time, according to Eriugena, the saved will gaze upon theophanies of theophanies, things unimaginably higher than what we can see here, but these still remain theophanies. Eriugena's translation of the Dionysian corpus and his Perifusion were by no means unknown from the 10th through the 12th centuries, but Dionysian theology experienced an unusual upsurge in the second quarter of the 13th century. Between 1230 and 1250, three important thinkers, Thomas Gallus, Robert Grosseteste, and Albert the Great, wrote whole commentaries on the whole Dionysian corpus. This is very unusual. In the 1240s, an unknown editor produced a glossed version of the Dionysian corpus that became a theological textbook at the University of Paris. Now, this new Dionysianism assumed two forms. In commentaries and glosses produced between 1230 and 1246, Thomas Gallus reinterpreted Dionysian negative theology in terms of the priority of affectivity. That is, what he called the supreme point of affectivity, the apex affectus, surpassed all intellectual vision or mental contact with God. Taken up by Franciscans, especially Bonaventure, and later by Carthusians, in such texts as the Cloud of Unknowing, this so-called affective Dionysianism became a significant strand in late medieval mysticism. In the later 1240s, Albert the Great began to study and teach the Dionysian writings, first at Paris and then at Cologne, and he had Thomas Aquinas actually as one of his students in these classes. Between 1248 and 1252, Albert produced a massive commentary that took the other side, arguing, and I quote, "It is necessary to be united to God through intellect." This intellective Dionysianism was to be of great significance for German Dominican theology and mysticism for the next century. Even in the mid-15th century, the debates over the respective roles of knowledge and love in the path to union with God, in which Nicholas of Cusa took part, are still, in a sense, a clash between the affective and the intellective forms of Dionysianism. The intellective Dionysianism was deeply involved in the debates over the nature of the beatific vision that occupied a whole century between roughly 1240 and 1340, until they were brought to a conclusion by Pope Benedict XII's condemnation of the view of his predecessor John the 22nd about the delay of the vision of God's essence until after the resurrection of the body. The first major moment in these debates, and I'll touch on only one or two aspects of them, the first major moment came in 1241 when the Bishop of Paris, William of Auvergne, and the authorities of the university attacked the view that even in heaven, God will not be seen directly, but only through theophanies. The first of 10 rejected articles in this condemnation states, "The first error is that the divine essence in itself will be seen neither by man nor angel. We reject this error, and we excommunicate its upholders and defenders by the authority of Bishop William. We firmly believe and assert that God will be seen in essence or substance by the angels and all the saints, and he will be seen by glorified souls. The denial of a direct vision of God in heaven was, as you might guess, an expression of a form of Dionysianism much influenced by Eriugena and a direct challenge to the traditional Augustinian position. We're not sure who its proponents were, though they seem to have included some Dominicans, a rather scandalous fact given that the preachers were the champions of orthodoxy. The condemnation, however, did not mean the end of all differences of opinion about the nature of the beatific vision, even among the Dominicans. While it was not possible to disagree directly with a pronouncement of such strong doctrinal weight, there was what we might call considerable wiggle room in how to interpret it. Thomas Aquinas' treatment of the beatific vision is a classic synthesis of the Augustinian position and directly takes on Eriugena's view of theophany. For example, in his commentary on the Epistle to the Hebrews, Thomas declares Eriugena's teaching on the need for theophanies in heaven to be heretical. Albert the Great, however, worked out a solution to the nature of the beatific vision that adhered to the Paris condemnation, agrees with it, cites it, but also managed to salvage the core of Dionysian negative theology. I'm not going to go into the details of Albert's position here. I did in my former talk this summer, but I only want to note one key difference that shows the distance between Albert and his student Thomas Aquinas. Albert continued to use the language of theophany to describe the way in which God's essence will be seen in heaven, even by means of the light of glory, the lumen gloriae. In his commentary on the Dionysian celestial hierarchy, he puts it this way. Thus, God himself is in each of the blessed as an illumination by whose participation he makes himself his own likeness. In such a likeness, the vision of God is called a theophany. In this way, the same God will be illumination and object illuminated. But object as he is in himself, illumination insofar as he is participated in by the blessed. Albert's student, Meister Eckhart, although he agreed that God cannot be seen through likenesses, tended to subvert traditional notions of what it means to see God through his teaching of what might be called ocular identity. Ocular identity as expressed, and I'll cite one of his sermons here. The eye with which I see God is the same eye in which God sees me. My eye and God's eye is one eye, one seeing, one knowing, one loving. Although Eckhart did not deny some difference between seeing here and seeing there in heaven, his radicalized, dialectical version of visio Dei elides essential distinctions between seeing God now and seeing God then. For Eckhart, the eschatological vision of God becomes immanentized in the atemporal birth of the Son in the soul. On the other side, however, Eckhart's insistence on a strong apophatic theology means that all vision of God, even the vision in heaven, is essentially a vision of God's nothingness. Again, I'll quote just one text from a German sermon. Eckhart says, one must receive God as he is a mode beyond measure, a being beyond being, for he has no limited mode. This kind of apophaticism, I think, will help explain Eckhart's critical attitude toward the visionary explosion of the later Middle Ages. And now I want to turn in a little bit more detail to this visionary explosion and two important reactions to it in the 13th and 14th centuries. The visionary explosion was part of an important shift in mysticism evident from the 12th century on that put increasing emphasis on what Bernard of Clairvaux famously called the Liber Experientiae, the book of experience. Contact with God, especially in the case of women, came to be more and more expressed in the language of personal encounter, though the many and subtle ways in which these visionary and auditory encounters were set down, both by the mystics and by their clerical scribes, preclude any simple reduction of such narratives to the category of autobiography. Indeed, it's clear that we are often dealing with what Franz Böhme memorably called the creation of a fiction that a fiction is not a fiction. Though the appearance of innovative modes of presenting visions and using them to convey mystical teaching argue for a new stage in the evolution of Western mysticism, I believe we should avoid simplistic notions of the emergence of what some German scholars have called a new experiential mysticism, Erlebnismystik. Rather than straightforward descriptions of visions and other ecstatic experiences, we are dealing with sophisticated texts that require close attention to their theological, cultural, literary contextualization and shaping in order to be properly understood. From this perspective, it may be helpful to make a distinction between vision and visualization. What are presented textually as supernaturally given visions breaking into the consciousness of the mystic contain important elements of visualization. That is, they are dependent both in reception and expression on the subject's power of imaginative seeing and construction. Visionary narratives were often created and always mediated by the religious person's meditation on the imagery of the Bible, participation in the action of the liturgy, prayerful gazing upon artistic representations of Christ, Mary, angels, and saints, as well, of course, as on his or her literary skill in what is being presented as a gift from God. I came across a phrase some months ago in Willa Cather's Death Comes from the Archbishop, which says, an apparition is a human vision corrected by divine love. a human vision corrected by divine love. Religious women were particularly adept practitioners of such modes of visualization. So how much any particular mystical vision may owe to the subject's or author's creative powers of visualization, while it's not easy to discern, is, I believe, a distinction that must be kept in mind. Medieval believers did not doubt that God could and did grant visions to certain favored souls, but they were more concerned about the truth of the teaching found in the vision than whether the vision was being recounted wie es eigentlich gewesen, as it actually, there it was like a movie. And this is evident from the fact that some mystics were quite prepared to admit that some of their visions were literary creations for teaching purposes. A good example can be found in Henry Suso, student of Meister Eckhart, but one who was more open to visionary narrative than Eckhart was to convey his message. Suso had one of the most powerful visual imaginations among all the mystics, I believe, of the late Middle Ages. To quote Jeffrey Hamburger, Suso first saw and then read. Suso's texts, both the four Middle High German works that make up the collection he called the Exemplar, and his immensely popular Latin Horologium Sapientiae, the Clock of Wisdom, are filled with imagistic showings. Not only those ascribed to the hero, the servant of eternal wisdom, but also to other holy friends of God, Gottesfreund. For the life of the servant, the presentation of the story of the servant of eternal wisdom as exemplar of mystical life, Suso even commissioned 12 illustrations for some of the visions that are recounted in the text. In his writings, Suso presents a sophisticated view of both the necessity for, as well as the limitations of, visions and images in the path to mystical union. One of these pictures and the vision it illustrates in the life will give you some sense of Suso's role or as exemplary of the visionary explosion of late medieval mysticism. I'm just going to use one example here. In the early chapters of the life of the servant, we're dealing, of course, with the beginning of the mystical path, and we find a plethora of descriptions of visionary and auditory experiences of supernatural beings. Chapter 5 is a good example because it recounts no less than 9 different examples of divine consolations, göttliches Trostes, the divine consolations that God uses in order to attract beginners on the path to union. The consolations begin with a perfectly normal form of consciousness. The servant is portrayed as greeting the dawn in thanks for the divine light giver. But the following 3 experiences shift to a more supernatural register, and they involve internal music. It comes partly from the servant himself, he's singing to himself, but partly from overhearing the angel's song. The 5th consolation in this chapter is both auditory and visual, as his guardian angel appears to the servant and leads him into another land, embraces him, consoles him. The 6th vision is the most visual, and it is the one that receives the illustration. Here the servant is portrayed as surrounded by the heavenly host in a vision, in a Gesicht. And he asks one of the angels to show him the hidden dwelling place of God in the soul. The angel commands him to look, just as angels bade John look at the heavenly scenes in the book of the Apocalypse. The account continues as follows. He, that's the servant, he quickly looked inside and saw that over his heart his body was clear as crystal. And he saw in the middle of his heart eternal wisdom, sitting quietly with a pleasing appearance. Nearby, the soul of the servant was sitting and longing for heaven. It was inclined in love at God's side, embraced by his arms and pressed to his divine heart. There, outside itself and immersed in love, it lay in the arms of its beloved God. Now, this is an Augustinian spiritual vision in a sense, but it's also in many ways quite different from Augustine's view of spiritual vision. First, it's self-referential, though in a way typical of Suso in that it places the servant both inside and outside himself, just as the whole life has a studied ambiguity about how far we should identify Suso with the servant. Secondly, the vision is much shaped by visual objects from Suso's religious milieu. The servant has become a kind of reliquary, or even a monstrance, whose crystal clarity allows a view of something sacred within, of the God within. The soul servant is inclined on the breast of eternal wisdom, exactly as the figure of John the Beloved is embraced by Christ in a well-known late medieval sculptural form. So Suso's talent for visualization has used these artistic images to create something new. The vision and its image, its picture, is an effective teaching tool, not only for what it obviously reveals about the relation between the soul of the servant and divine wisdom, but also for what it suggests about the importance of visions in the beginning of the mystical life by its placement so early in the text. Now, Suso never denies that you don't abandon visions totally, the way Suso abandoned his extreme imitation of the Passion. Visions occur later on and are defended later on in the book, but the majority of the visions, interestingly enough, are early on in the life of the servant. Suso also reflected on the role of images and visions, and I want to dwell with that just for a few minutes here. In the prologue to the Exemplar, Suso says of the life of the servant that, and I quote, "It is entirely about the life of a beginner in a figurative way." The German is mit bildgebende Weise, in a figurative way. And in a hidden way, it shows how a beginner should order his inner and outer self according to God's dearest will. By way of giving examples, mit glücknisgebende Weise, by way of giving examples, it describes many holy works that actually took place. Now, the exemplary nature of the narrative is made clear here, but it is important to note that Suso says that many, but not all of the things recounted actually happened. The point is made even more clearly in the prologue to his Latin Clock of Wisdom. Here Suso explicitly says that the visions in the work need not all be taken literally, though many were perceived by him in such a way. They are all described as figurata locutio, that is, literally speaking by way of figures, such as we find in biblical parallels. He explicitly says the Bible uses figurata locutio. He adds, and I quote, "All these things are true, not according to the letter, but according to their true significations. The attentive reader will easily note the hidden mysteries of this speaking through figures if he makes a skillful effort. That is, if he recognizes how images and visions are both necessary, but also limited in mystical praxis." As a mystagogical strategy, Suso's figurata locutio does not differentiate between visionary event and literary elaboration, and does not hesitate to introduce what we would call fictional visions into narrative of different forms of perhaps real showings. Suso does not feel it necessary to give clues about which visions really happened and which did not. What we might be tempted to separate as fact versus fiction is all part of one overarching didactic strategy. To be sure, many late medieval visionaries, especially those who were subject to challenge like most women, felt they needed to present all their visions as literally true, but Suso's practice may well have been more widespread than we can prove. Suso's presentation of eternal wisdom in his breast demonstrates something of the visual creativity of late medieval visionaries. Among the wealth of showings found in late medieval mystical literature, you can also find many that call into question the standard Augustinian categories, those that differentiate between the corporeal, the spiritual, and the intellectual. Again, I want to look at just one example. The Flemish beguine Hadewijch of Antwerp seems to have lived in the mid-13th century, though a minority view still places her in the early 14th. Hadewijch exemplifies a new form of vision that is both highly pictorial as well as frankly corporeal in its description of the mystic's reception of the showing. Nevertheless, many of her showings are also presented as providing Hadewijch a direct intellectual grasp of divine truths about the Trinity and other celestial matters. Her Vision 7 records a typical experience of late medieval female mystics, a powerfully erotic experience of oneness with Christ taking place in a Eucharistic setting. Begins with a Pentecost vision at dawn while matins are being sung. At first she experiences extreme physical symptoms, such as trembling and quaking with madness and fear, lest I did not content my beloved, and that my beloved did not content me. After this description of her outer and inner troubled state, her first-person narrative moves to a visual register. Hadewijch says she saw an eagle flying from the altar toward her with a message to prepare herself for an encounter with Christ. Then he came from the altar, showing himself as a child, bearing the Eucharistic elements of bread and wine. Suddenly Christ changes from a child into a beautiful man, as he was at the time of the Passion. And then he gives himself to the beguine, first sacramentally and then physically. I quote the text here at a little length. Then he gave himself to me in the shape of the sacrament, in its outward form, as the custom is. Then he gave me to drink from the chalice in form and taste, as the custom is. After that he came to me, took me entirely in his arms, and pressed me to him. And all my members felt his in full felicity, in accordance with the desire of my heart and my humanity. But this sense of physical satisfaction was not the end. As Hadewijch goes on to say that she lost sight of the manly beauty of Christ's form so that she could no longer distinguish him within or without. She says, then it was to me as if we were one without difference. This without difference, ohne Differentie qualification, suggests that the mystical union, the final one here, goes beyond the erotic model in which two persons become one in flesh into a kind of union of identity. However, in this context, I cite the example not to discuss late medieval models of mystical union, but rather to note how this visionary account fuses the corporeal and imaginative realms and yet also involves a conviction of oneness with the divine nature of an intellectual character. And it's this mingling of aspects, different aspects, that I think breaks the Augustinian model in the later Middle Ages. And I use Hadewijch here just as one example, with many other examples, Julian of Norwich, etc. But the proliferation of visionary narratives that I've suggested here, many of them of a new form and making strong claims to authority, initiated even more extensive debates than the debates over the nature of the beatific vision. And it's with these that I'd like to spend the last part of this lecture. The reactions to the visionary explosion fall into two broad streams. The first is the growth of interest in what the medievals called discernment of spirits, discretio spirituum. That is, the rules for sorting out good from bad impulses and good from bad visions. The second stream is the surprising appearance of an anti-visionary reaction among many mystics themselves. The discernment of spirits has received a good deal of scholarly attention of late, so I'll only give a brief summary here. The theme is rooted in Scripture, especially in Paul's listing of discernment of spirits among the charisms that the Spirit gives to the church in 1 Corinthians 12. It also, of course, has as a base text the warning in 1 John, the 4th verse of the 1st chapter, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. Discernment, discretio, in the broad sense as a form of contemplative wisdom that issues in a life of obedience and moderation, was much cultivated in monasticism, both patristic and medieval. This discernment was primarily directed towards the self, as a praxis involving, in part, distinguishing the good and evil impulses in one's intentions and actions. And this broad view of discernment continues on through the later Middle Ages. It's well expressed, for example, in the words that God addresses to Catherine of Siena in chapter 9 of her dialogue. God says, discernment is nothing else but the true knowledge a soul ought to have of herself and of me. And through this knowledge she finds her roots. It is joined to charity like an engrafted shoot. Discernment of spirits in the more narrow sense is a late medieval development. This form of discernment sought to establish guidelines and rules to distinguish the good from the bad spirits in other people, especially in heretics and in those who made claims to visionary contact with God. Canonically, It had its source in a letter of Innocent III that he sent to the clergy of Mainz in 1199 concerning the dangers of secret conventicles, false preaching, and heresy. In this letter, which made it into canon law, Innocent lays on the clergy the obligation to distinguish good from evil in such matters. He says, there is need for greater discernment, because vices can secretly work their way in under the guise of virtues, and Satan's angel can pretend to be and transform himself into an angel of light. At the beginning of the 14th century, the Augustinian Henry of Frimaes, contemporary of Eckhart and member of the commission that condemned Marguerite Porete to death, wrote the first formal treatise on the topic, the Tractatus Super Quatuor Instinctibus, the treatise on the four promptings, if you will, the four internal promptings that incline humans to action: the divine prompting, angelic, diabolical, and natural promptings. Henry is much worried about mistaking merely natural instincts for divine or angelic ones, but also, of course, about the diabolical action of the devil. Now, Henry's treatise still has a relatively broad focus, but several of his contemporaries who wrote on this, Augustine of Ancona, Venturino of Bergamo, became more and more concerned with evoking discernment, to quote the latter, in the case of visions, revelations, or experiences that are supernatural or beyond the common ken of those who love or fear God. In the troubled times of the Great Schism and its aftermath towards the end of the 14th century and the early 15th century, when visionaries and prophets abounded, discernment of spirits, or at least writing treatises about it, became a cottage industry. In 1383, the German theologian Henry of Langenstein wrote the first work specifically with that name on discernment of spirits. Pierre Dailly composed 2 tracts on false prophets, and his student Jean Gerson wrote no less than 3 works on discernment. Catherine of Siena, Birgitte of Sweden, and Joan of Arc are just some of the visionaries whose showings were subjected to discernment analysis, sometimes with unhappy results. Now, what has not yet been systematically studied, and which I will close with, are some remarks on the second reaction, that is, the criticism of visionary claims made by mystics themselves. And it wasn't until really my recent reading for the late medieval volume that the power of this particular tradition became more and more obvious to me. More and more mystical texts that I read, I kept finding these kinds of criticisms. Obviously not in every, but in so many. This anti-visionary tradition originated in the 13th century and grew strong in the 14th, and continued on, as you might expect. To be sure, opponents of the visionary explosion found it difficult to condemn revelations and visions totally, since they were witnessed to in the Bible and had been ascribed to many of the post-biblical saints and leaders of the church. Mystical opposition to visions, therefore, came in several varieties, ranging from those who rejected visions outright on the basis of an argument that the age of visions belonged to the good old days and not to the evil present age, to others who sought to show that visions were at best peripheral to the real pursuit of God and at worst a distraction and danger. Among the earliest witnesses to the anti-visionary movement was the German Franciscan David of Augsburg, dies in 1272. David's ascetical and mystical teaching is not Franciscan in the sense we know from Bonaventure in the literature about Francis. It harks back rather to the Cistercian Victorine mysticism of the 12th century, and therefore may explain why he's so nervous about visions. In the 1240s, he wrote a very popular spiritual handbook. Over 300 manuscripts of this survive. And at the end of the 3rd book of this manual for novice masters, we find a treatise on prayer, including a treatment of pure interior prayer that leads to union with God. This is the mystical part of that treatise. It's both ascetical and mystical. This last part of the 3rd book also has a treatment of visions, revelations, and ecstatic experiences that takes a decidedly negative attitude. David says, the less we meddle with such matters, the less opportunity there will be for deception. Of course, he allows that God sometimes consoles his saints with visions. But he is obviously worried about the kind of vision that we've seen in the case of Hadewijch. He specifically warns against visions involving embracing, kissing, and being caressed in other less decent ways, as he delicately puts it, ways that would disturb both the exterior and interior person. At the turn of the 14th century, Marguerite Porete and Meister Eckhart, two of the most important mystics of the time, also took a largely negative attitude towards visions of God and the saints. Porete herself, a Beguine, seems to have been even more critical than Eckhart of the dangers of desiring to see God. Although she had a great interest in what we might call specularity, imaging, especially in the role of her book, The Mirror of Simple Souls, as a visible image of the way in which the annihilated soul vanishes so that God can see himself in the soul as a non-existent mirror, she does not recount in her book any appearances of Christ or manifestations of the saints. The mirror is a dialogue among various personifications, dialogue, not a visionary narrative. And Poret's apophatic message about the necessity for total annihilation means that visions, even visions of the highest sort, are not important for her. In our usual hyperbolic way, in chapter 49, one of these personification figures, Love, proclaims that willing nothing in God is better than even willing the good in God. To the extent that will remains in persons, everything they do is tainted. Even, she says, if they could be raptured into heaven each day to see the Trinity on account of such a will, as was St. Paul. Now, since Paul's rapture to the third heaven of 2 Corinthians 12 is traditionally considered the highest of mystical visions, Poret's comment is startling, and it also helps explain her studied disregard of lower forms of vision. Meister Eckhart's attitude toward the visionary explosion of late medieval mysticism was guarded, but also essentially negative. As a good scholastic, he was aware of the long discussion among the doctors over whether or not Moses and Paul had really seen God in this life, and he several times discusses this and the nature of rapture in general, but in his Latin works, where he adheres to a basic Thomistic Augustinian view. But Eckhart's attitude toward the obsession with visions he found around him, especially in the Dominican nuns and Beguines to whom he preached, was part of the critical correlation by which he sought to encourage and learn from certain aspects of female mysticism, while also being ready to correct and criticize what he found suspect, such as the visionary impulse. His most famous statement against vision takes an ironic tone. Famous text, German Sermon 16b, declares, "Some people want to see God with their own eyes, just as they see a cow. They want to love God just as they love a cow. You love a cow for the milk and the cheese, and because of your own advantage. This is how all those people act who love God because of external riches or because of internal consolation." So for Eckhart, the desire for visions was just another form of spiritual self-centeredness, the refusal to detach from all created things that are not God, the self-centeredness that's the fundamental barrier to a true spiritual life. Many of the late medieval women visionaries themselves, while willing to recount their showings and use them as didactic tools, go out of their way to emphasize the secondary status of visionary experience. I'll cite just two examples. Franciscan Tertiary Angela Foligno, who recounts numerous appearances of Christ to her, concludes her long and intricate path to God, described in the memorial, with an apophatic plunge into divine nothingness, in and with darkness. Hence it comes as no surprise that in the instructions that are supposed to contain her subsequent teaching to circles of devoted followers, she says in one place, "O my dearest sons, of what use are revelations, visions, feelings of God's presence, sweetnesses from Him? Of what use are gifts of wisdom, elevations? Of what use even is contemplation? Indeed, all these are useless unless one has true knowledge of God and self." Now, perhaps this is editorializing by one of her followers, but the same point was made by an even more famous visionary, Julian of Norwich, in the long text of her showings, text that, as far as we know, was not subject to clerical editing. Julian's 15 visions of Christ on the cross, given her on May 13th, 1373, as she lay dying, the source for her whole mystical teaching. expounded as it was not once but twice in the short and long versions of the book she worked on for at least 3 decades. She makes it quite clear that it is the content of the visions, that is, God's overpowering salvific love and our response to it, that is important, not the visions themselves. In chapter 9 of the long text, she says, I am not good because of the revelations, but only if I love God better. And inasmuch as you love God better, it is more to you than to me. For I am sure that there are many who never had revelations or visions, but only the common teaching of Holy Church who love God better than I do. I'll conclude with 2 texts, the 2 most decisive rejections of visions, and they come from anonymous 14th century German texts. First is the mystical dialogue known as the Schwester Katrai, or Sister Catherine, might date to about 1330. The second is the Book of Spiritual Poverty, which seems to date from the 3rd quarter of the 14th century. In both these works, corporeal and imaginative visions are strongly attacked. The Sister Catherine, which is sometimes ascribed to Eckhart, has 2 major parts. The first tells the story of how an anonymous beguine gives up the formal spiritual direction of her friar confessor to go off into exile, obviously a kind of internal exile, an exile in which she experiences a transformation of a decidedly Eckhartian character. After a 3-day mystical death, she is permanently established in eternity, and that enables her to change roles with her confessor. The enlightened beguine is now his instructor in a series of 9 dialogues or instructions that make up the long second part of the work. The Sister Catherine contains much challenging and difficult material, though I do not think it is a heretical free spirit text, as some have said. Because Sister Catherine not only attacks false mysticism, but also in the 8th instruction mounts what is perhaps the most powerful late medieval attack on the desire for corporeal and spiritual visions. Christ's physical and imaginative presence, she says, needs to be removed if a soul is to attain true inner understanding of the Trinity. She puts it this way. The people who want to seek God with exterior eyes are unbelieving people. Here the devil confirms them in their wrong belief, so that they stay with him eternally. In the air he takes from the elements whatever shape he wants and appears to people when and how he wants to. Sometimes as a child with curly hair in the consecrated host. At other times he appears to them as a youth of 12 or a pious man of 30. The author might have been reading the Hadewijch vision noted above. But he or she rejects such showings as diabolical forms of dangerous exterior religion. Concluding, as the author says, since Christ has gone to his heavenly Father, no one has seen him with exterior eyes. The Book of Spiritual Poverty is a textbook of the Eckartian mysticism of the ground. Along with the better-known Theology of Deutsch, it was at times ascribed to John Tauler and so had a significant impact on later mystical literature. As befits its systematic character, it takes up almost all the themes and elements of late medieval mysticism, including a long section on discernment of spirits. It could scarcely avoid the issue of visions. Once again, however, we find a strongly negative view of visions as dangerous delusions. Discussing the difference between true and false freedom, the book twice attacks both the free spirit heretics and those who desire visions or revelations that would uncover previously hidden secrets. Such desires are dangerous, not only because they threaten humility, but also because of the strong possibility of diabolical delusion. At the end of the treatise, the author summarizes, if a person attaches importance to visions and concerns himself with images, that is a sign that his ground is not simple and pure, for in a pure and simple ground nothing is born but God and what is godlike. God is invisible and beyond all images, so they are deceived who accept visions. It would be easy to pursue the story of the mystical reaction to the visionary explosion further into the 15th century, such as in Nicholas of Cusa, and even into early modern mysticism. The point, I hope, is made. Visions and visualizations, both here on earth and even in the visio beatifica to come, were never simple, uncontroversial, generally agreed upon aspects of Christian belief and practice. Instead, they provide fruitful avenues of access into some of the major debates that helped shape the Christian mystical tradition. One final word. It seems fitting to talk about mysticism under the auspices of the William James lectureship a bit more than a century after the publication of his classic Varieties. I'm not a James scholar, though like so many others I've read and reread Varieties, thinking along with James, learning from him both when I agree and when I feel I have to disagree. On June 16, 1901, in the midst of giving the Gifford lectures that became Varieties, James wrote to the Reverend Henry Rankin, who had provided him with materials for his talks, claiming, and I quote, "The mother sea and fountainhead of all religions lie in the mystical experiences of the individual," taking the mystical in a very wide sense. The degree to which we can assent to this pronouncement will depend to a large extent on just how wide is wide, and how one understands that slippery term, mystical experience. Actually, in the chapters devoted to mysticism in the Varieties, James tends to talk of mystical states of consciousness, a much better term, I think, although mystical experience slips in from time to time. What was surprising, at least to me, when I reread the chapters recently, is that James sided with the critics of visions rather than with their proponents. In a footnote in one of those chapters, he says that visual and auditory hallucinations and the like have no essential mystical significance, for they occur with no consciousness of illumination. Consciousness of illumination is for us the essential mark of mystical states. Of course, many figures of the visionary explosion of the Middle Ages would claim that their visionary and auditory experiences did convey illumination. James does not discuss the criteria by which he distinguished between visual and auditory hallucinations and showings that claim personal illumination, his criterion, but I think his view of illuminative states of consciousness as the main criterion for the mystical did share important elements with the late medieval critics of visions and visualizations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor McGinn. I expect that there will be some questions, and we have almost 15 minutes before I will invite everyone into a reception in the Brown Room at the opposite end of the building down this way when you go out. So let's turn now to those who have questions or comments on this fine lecture.
Yes.
In many of your English translations of the mystics critiquing vision, you add that the critique seemed to be that in fact it was the desire to have the corporeal vision, not the vision itself. Is there room in this new typology of what's legitimate and what isn't for the corporeal vision unbidden or unasked for? Is it the desire that's the problem, the cultivation of such vision, or is it the actual vision itself?
That's a good point, because I think that the desire is crucial here. And it's possibly one of the escape clauses that those, of course, who are not happy with visions nevertheless have to keep in there because of the visionary trajectory in history, both from the Bible and on through the tradition. That is, God may give visions, but you should never want them, and you should never desire them. So I think in a sense it's a little bit of both, because it's very difficult in Christianity to say visions are all bad. You can't say that. You might say, well, visions were good then, but they're not good now. Or given the fact, particularly the mysticism of Eckhart and Porret and others, that all desire is bad, the desire to have visions would be the worst kind of desire in a sense, because it's a desire that tries to force God in a certain way. So thank you for the point. Yes? No.
I'll let you just...
Well, you're next and then... Yes.
Okay, I was just going to follow up on that, though. If desire is the problem, then why would it be specifically related to corporeal kinds of visions and corporeal experiences rather than intellectual and so forth?
I think in the case of the figures that I'm quoting, it's not just the corporeal. That is, it's any kind of image, if you will, even internally. And again, they don't put this in the context of a tripartition of visions in the way that they're talking about. They are reacting to a situation in which particularly these kinds of corporeal visions, however, are obviously creating kind of nervousness as you can see in David and of Augsburg and others. But I think with Eckhart, you remember Eckhart says, desiring to see God with your external eyes is bad, but even desire for internal consolations would be bad. Again, because it's desire, and desire is what has to be overcome. Yes?
Professor, I think this is a question of neophyte. As I'm reading Christian mystical texts and Arabic Islamic texts for the first time really this semester. And in my directory readings, I found that out of all kinds of comparative theology, comparative study of mystics and their texts has a particularly vexed history. My question for you then is, in trying to make sense of, and possibly theologizing out of our mystical traditions, what value do you see in juxtaposing mystic texts from different traditions and reading them back and forth together?
I think it's absolutely crucial for the proper understanding of even one's own tradition. And I can speak a little bit autobiographically to that. I've for long been interested in Jewish mysticism and to a lesser extent in Islamic mysticism. And I've had the opportunity, both in Jerusalem and in Chicago, to teach courses with experts on Jewish mysticism like my friend Moshe Yidel and various others. And it really has opened my eyes to so much that I would have missed in the Christian tradition. Obviously, there's an ecumenical aspect to this, trying to understand another tradition. But you'll never, I think, understand your own tradition until you begin to see it through the eyes of another tradition, things that pop out at you. One perfect example, to give just one, the role of esotericism in both the Islamic and in the Jewish tradition is an extremely important part of their mysticism. Whereas in Christianity, Christian mysticism, esotericism is dangerous and has been a continuing temptation and danger. Why is that the case? Now, I actually bring it back to the great controversy of Gnosticism, the 2nd and 3rd century. But I don't think I would have ever seen that is a crucial difference unless I had puzzled over the fact that why is Christianity so different from Islam and Jewish mysticism in that case? So whether one comes at it, I believe, from either the Jewish and Islamic side or the Christian side, I think many contemporary scholars of mysticism would say that this is not an addition, it's not icing on the cake in a certain sense. It's crucial to the proper study of mysticism in the current situation. Let me do one over here and then I'll come back. Yes, Jeffrey.
I'm wondering if you could put some of what you presented to us in the context of other areas on which you've written extensively, particularly apocalypticism, and then perhaps to a lesser extent sacramental theology. I'd be interested to know to what extent these critics of the visionary tradition are systematic thinkers. In other words, how do they line up vis-a-vis the apocalyptic tradition? In other words, how do they deal with a figure like John in the Book of Revelation? And in terms of sacramental theology, which is so predicated on visible signs, symbols, and rituals, what are their attitudes about that? And how do they harmonize? Because you mentioned the example of Benjamin of Bergamo, whom I know from a very different context as a flagellant who was, if not excommunicated, placed under observation, as it were, and regarded as a very dangerous rabble-rouser.
Yeah.
And yet here he is criticizing others for heterodox or suspicious behavior. I'm curious, to what extent can we make generalizations about these critics of the visionary tradition? How local is their criticism, or is it part of a systematic outlook?
I think it's extremely difficult at this stage to create a general picture, and that's why I said very explicitly that less has been done, really, with the criticism of visions than with the discernment of spirits. I mean, we've had half a dozen books on discernment of spirits in the last few years. So my impression is it's too complex, at least for me at this stage, to generalize about. But I would say make one or two observations in this sense. That is, one could accept, again, the visions given to biblical figures, such as John in Revelation and various others, and say that there's a kind of end to that visionary tradition, and now we live off those visions through sacraments and through various other, if you will, manifestations of the life of the church. That would be one general tendency. The other one would be to take figures like Angelo Foligno and Julian and others whom I've mentioned who want to emphasize visions are there. I've had visions. They were important for me, but I want to stress it's the content of the vision, as Julian puts it. Or, it is the love that is manifested, which is really important. So whether you have a vision or don't have a vision, this is what you need to get out of it in a certain sense. The larger question, one other comment, this David of Augsburg is highly critical of the Joachite tradition as well as of the, if you will, the mystical visionary tradition. So there are places where the critics, see those things coming together. So that Joachim's people and those who announce visions of things to come are also attacked in that third book of his treatise. The question of the relation between the apocalyptic and the mystical is probably too big a topic to go into at this stage, although I tried to write a few essays on it recently. Yes?
Well, I was pressing in the same direction in my mind, and then when you mentioned Joachim and your work on that group reminds me of the earlier period, and Josephus dealing with the fourth philosophy, and very, very worried because of its political implications. So I guess it would be back to a question that perhaps you've already answered, and there isn't evidence really to deal with it there. But are some of the critics worried that some of these visions have political implications that would be negative and disruptive?
Oh, very much so. Particularly at the time of the Great Schism. Because let's remember, Brigitte of Sweden, Catherine of Siena, and a whole range of other visionaries less known today were definitely giving political messages about which pope to back and what to do to end the schism, etc., etc., etc. And let's remember Joan of Arc, on the basis of her visions, taking a definite political and military move. So the political implications of the discernment of visions side of the reaction to the visionary, I think, is very crucial. In terms of the other tradition, that is the mystics' criticism of the visionary explosion, it's harder to tease out, at least for me, definite political implications. But, they may be there. But it's very clear with regard to discernment of spirits tradition. Yeah. Yes,
I was
Fred.
interested in your reservation about the phrase religious experience and your preference for state of consciousness.
Yeah.
Why?
Because I think in many systems of epistemology, experience is seen as something that's prior to thought and prior to consideration, and therefore the basis, the general tradition says all mystical experience is the same, and then theological thinking and systems are built on top of it. That, to me, I think is far too easy. That mystical consciousness involves the whole of the human loving and knowing process in that sense, and that if we want to take experience as somehow, some separable thing, we make a great mistake. That also reflects on the difference between that some would see between mysticism and mystical theology. Again, I think that has been seen far too artificially in the history of Christian thought. Mysticism expresses itself through theology in a whole variety of different ways. So, that's a short answer to a very complicated question. But consciousness, which can involve everything from the range of what we could call data up to insight and understanding, I think is a much better phrase. Yes?
Does the language of dreams occur in these texts? Is there discussion between vision of dreams and relationship?
That's an interesting question, and would have to be answered individually. Some of these texts do distinguish between visions given in dreams and visions that are given in waking circumstances. And certain texts make it extremely difficult to distinguish which is which. One of the earliest of the major, if you will, kind of first-person accounts of a series of visions actually occurs way back in the early 12th century with the Benedictine Rupert of Deutz. And I think it's book 12 of his commentary on Matthew. It's a long account of the experiences, his mystical experiences. Many of them are explicitly portrayed as dream experiences. Many of them, it's very difficult to say whether he's saying he's dreaming or whether this happens at night and he's awake or partly awake, etc. And I think you could find a similar ambiguity, if you will, in many of the later visionaries. So others, it's quite clear, that they are in church. They're supposedly not asleep, but who knows? And they are having certain experiences in the course of the liturgy, etc. So I don't know whether the answer is it's complicated, and it does involve at times dream visions too. If you get Scripture has lots of examples of dream visions too.
The language of the Bible, and I was just thinking of the prophetic word, the word I saw, the prophet said.
Right.
I expect we should allow you to rest unless there are another burning question. We are very, very grateful for an illuminating lecture and actually very illuminating answers to the questions. Thank you so much. I'll repeat the invitation to a reception in the Brown Room at the end of the building this way. You're all welcome. I hope you will join us and our lecturer. Thank you again and good night.
Thanks very much. Thank you both.